Welcome to Law Easy. My name is Marty Shenkman. I'm joined for this video clip by Brian Boak, an insurance consultant. Welcome, Brian.
Thank you.
We're going to talk about a really important topic that affects many people, and again is something that is very often overlooked. And just so you know, there's a series of video clips with Brian and I about basic insurance planning and not so basic insurance planning that are all important. This topic is really about scheduled property, blanket coverage. What do you do with collections and collectible items of specific value? So, Brian, if a consumer has an expensive jewelry or art collection, sports memorabilia, what do they need to know to make sure it's insured? Because doing nothing is not going to protect them. What do they need to do?
All policies have limits of some type, specifically on jewelry. Okay. Sometimes there's a limit on replacement cost in reference to which age or notoriety affects its value. So those items of value should be listed on a policy.
But the general coverage, if you don't take a specific action of getting a more blanket coverage or scheduling it, which you'll define, I believe aren't those often fairly limited and not enough for many people?
For example, for jewelry, your policy could have a limit of $1,000 or maybe $5,000.
Right. Not enough for many people.
Not enough for most.
Okay. So what is, I think everyone knows it, but let's explain it because there may be some nuances. What does it mean to schedule my jewelry or art on a policy? What does it require, and how does that protect me?
It depends on the insurance company. There are two ways to put items of value on a policy. One is called scheduled, and it literally means that you put the name of the item, you put a description of it, and you put a value. Depending on the insurance company, whether you can just put a value on it or whether you need to have an appraisal for that item will vary.
One of the things that people should think of doing, if they do have valuable property, tangibles that they're going to schedule, it's really worth getting an independent appraiser in to do an inventory of those items. They'll photograph them properly, and believe me, the professional photographs are outstanding compared to what I've certainly tried to do on my own and seen clients do on their own, because they know how to photograph an object and how to set it up, the lighting, the background to make sure it's visible. They can describe it properly, which is something that if you're not in the industry is not often intuitive, and they can give you an appraisal of it so you have real data to show. And it's not only for purposes of the information to schedule it, but if there ever is a loss, you now have detailed inventory by an independent professional to show what you've lost.
With the correct value. Because
Yes.
if you have a diamond ring and you don't have an appraisal for it, you don't know the cut, the clarity, the size.
Correct.
Or the real value.
And if you don't describe it properly,
Right.
you've done nothing.
You can only get paid for what you can tell the insurance company.
So what are some of the mistakes you see when people schedule property? And then we'll do blanket coverage after that. What are some of the tips or problems you've seen with how people handle scheduled property other than not doing it?
Not doing it is the key item, and they don't do it because they think it's expensive. And the reason they think it's expensive is because they've scheduled jewelry in the past. And jewelry is the most expensive item, one of the most expensive items to schedule, where art, antiques, collectibles, wine are all fairly inexpensive to insure.
And I think the answer is obvious, but why don't you explain why is it more expensive to insure a piece of jewelry than an piece of artwork hanging on my wall that's not leaving?
The not leaving is the key. The piece of art hanging on the wall sits there, is generally safe. If somebody breaks into your house, yes, they could steal it, but taking a 3-foot by 5-foot item out of the house is pretty hard. But taking a small ring or a clasp breaking.
Falls off, lost.
Correct. Take your watch off to wash your hands.
Forget it at the sink. What about blanket coverage? Explain what it is and say when it may make sense in part as an alternative to scheduled property. And when might you want to schedule certain items, blanket coverage for others?
So we generally recommend people to schedule their more valuable items. That way there's a detailed description. And the more valuable items, they're less likely to either trade in or get rid of one way or another. Blanket coverage allows you to say, I have $100,000, $300,000 worth of jewelry or art or sports memorabilia. But none of it's really expensive. It's all individually under $10,000 an item. This way, if you trade or get rid of or add a piece
You don't need to change your coverage.
You don't have to change the list.
Right.
Okay. You might have to increase your coverage because you bought more, but you might also say, I have $300,000 worth of jewelry, but I don't think I could possibly lose more than $100,000 at one time because of the way it's set up.
And is that reasonable to do?
It's a way to be cost conscious. It depends on your risk and your exposure. Your most valuable items, if you want to save money, put them in a bank vault. If you use a brooch once a year at holiday time, put it in a bank vault, and the price on the jewelry coverage will go down dramatically.
Doesn't mean not to insure it.
Correct. It's still listed on the policy, but it's in vault coverage.
Right. Many people assume that because it's in a safe deposit box, you don't need to insure it. That's a mistake. You want to comment on that just to drive that point home?
You really have to cover it because if it's in a safety deposit box, it's going to come out at some point in time.
And things happen to banks. They catch
Correct.
fire. It happens. How does one determine the appropriate level for blanket coverage?
It's a personal choice on your own risk management. You decide, I want to cover everything, but I just don't want to list all the items. Or I want to cover what I don't keep at the house, or what I don't keep in the safe, or what I keep out, or what I'm going to be wearing at any one particular time.
A couple of comments. Assume if there's ever an estate or an estate tax audit, the agents will ask to see your scheduled property. They're well aware that people schedule, as Brian explained, more expensive items, and they're going to want to see that. If you have items listed on an insurance policy as scheduled items, artwork, et cetera, and those items do not appear on an estate tax return, you better have an answer, because that's going to be a question you're posed to. Also consider that when you get things properly appraised and defined in terms of the descriptions and everything else, that's a great roadmap for how you create documentation to distribute personal property under a will or an estate plan. Those descriptions can be very helpful, and having the list is very helpful. Blanket items, it's much more difficult. You don't have the detail. Where's a listing of what you have? So just keep in mind how it ties together with your other coverage. One last question, and I don't mean to put you on the spot if there's not a quick answer, but it's not uncommon for people to have trusts where these irrevocable trusts own and even often buy tangible items like artwork, and then the artwork is permitted by the beneficiary to hold in their house, but it's owned by a trust. How should people address the insurance for those tangibles?
Many times an insurance company will allow you to add the trust on to the current insurance policy as an additional insured for the specific items that it owns.
Keeping that in mind as well, because too often people don't correlate and coordinate how something is owned with how it's insured, and we discussed that in one of the other video clips, and very important to do. Any final thoughts, or we're good?
The key is make sure the appraisals are current and make sure the schedule is current. There's no reason to insure items you no longer have.
Right. Thank you for joining us. Please bear in mind that the video is for educational purposes only. Please don't take any action without consulting a professional advisor. Thank you.